I want to talk about tag security and how open source contributions can accelerate your career arc. Hi, Andy. I'm from Control Plane, testing various AI generated new logos. I've done various things. I was also previously involved with SANS. I love the organization, bit of training for various organizations, and I'm a co chair in tag security. And that's what I want to talk about today, my journey getting there and what it's brought me and the advantages it can bring one and all. I also work for Open UK, helping to prevent government mishaps. So, what and why is tag security? It is a group of individuals. You can see from the GitHub repo, it's under the CNCF, the Cloud Native Computing Foundation, and it is a technical advisory group, which means three things, of course. One, it's a collective of individuals on a voluntary basis. Second of all, it is purely advisory. We provide a function to the overseeing governing body of the CNCF. We are not blockers, as security perhaps sometimes is, and we're deeply technical. This is not hand wavy security. It is under the skin, trying to understand the different actors, different positions and perspectives that people have on a particular project. We work on hard security problems for the cloud native space. Our logo is a trash panda, which is an mechanism for a raccoon. And I'm pleased to say the raccoon is quite easy to generate with AI. Why is this a problem? Well, of course, open source has been at the forefront of digital transformations for the past 10 plus years, and the groundswell of enthusiasm that we've seen have lowered costs for adopting organizations, but they've also introduced a new risk. And when the Linux Foundation, which is living and breathing open source, starts to sponsor Kubernetes and cloud native, this inherent dissonance between the advantages that an organization can gain and the risks that are inherent wrap up in themselves. On top of this, there's a whole lot of new code, and new code is where untested code paths can potentially lead to vulnerabilities. They also lead to new patterns and practices of deployment, and these things require scrutiny. They require testing. Often things are not clear until something's been battle tested months or years. So we work in this space in order to try and harden, strengthen, and robustify the open source ecosystem. Oh, what does tag security do? Well, we have a charter. We perform assessments for projects looking to graduate, which means as the CNCF launch a new project, it goes through multiple stages that involve incubation, sandbox, where they kind of play and find their feet, eventually working up to graduation, which is where they become a fully fledged member and they enjoy some of the benefits of being a CNCF project, including a marketing budget, the massive amplification that one gets from being on the CNCF landscape, and the supporting financial advantages that venture capital and private equity will see from that open source community-based approach to product development. We also take presentations from new projects who maybe aren't graduating, but are looking for some sort of objective questioning or advice. There are working groups that produce specific outputs. And finally, we report back to the TOC on a monthly basis to, I hesitate to say demonstrate value, but prove that we're conformant to the TOC charter and overall the CNCF's ultimate mission. It is really worth understating. It is done on a voluntary basis. And so there is a non-corporate approach to security from that perspective. So the mission itself, we're just trying to reduce risk. That is a broad and frankly unbounded problem set. That is the risk of compromise of end user data, functionally identifying information, the risk of being bounced through for a next attack. So how do we do this? Publishing educational resources. We have published a number of white papers. We've published advisory to other special interest groups and tagged in the CNCF. We also have run a CTF at KubeCon for a number of years to build people up and to help educate as to the risks of running cloud native applications so that from a Sun Tzu perspective, we know our enemy and then can harden our systems against them. We're there as a reference point to ask questions for other people, finding scenarios, identifying potential projects for consideration, cross-pollinating knowledge with other projects and tags. I mean, it sounds grandiose. It's actually quite difficult. Finding the time to form the primary function as well as working in the ecosystem is a more difficult challenge. And integrating relevant external standards. Anybody who's worked with a specific NIST or PCI or HIPAA regulation will understand that that is a level setting game of balancing that can be a little bit tricky. So, as the points, well, we're looking basically to help secure projects and to make sure that we don't have our SolarWinds moment or our Spectre moment as a cloud native community. Thirdly, action and tooling generation and understanding reasonably bounded and clear. Importantly, we are not a standards body. There is absolutely no interest in trying to anneal the world into our own form of objective or our lens. Compliance body, umbrella organization, certification board. We're not an abstract security oracle. I hesitate to overuse the word. Very constrained to cloud native and the projects under the Cloud Native Computing Foundation. Device security, ultimately, native involves the shared responsibility model, and therefore we're less interested in the underlying hardware and more in the software abstractions, containers, and virtualization that build on top of those. And non-cloud related trust and safety concerns are not our concern. The Oversight Committee rule the roost, as I've said. That is because CNCF is a voluntary organization. In order to join, people pay a membership fee, but they're looking some accountability for the expenditure of that money. And that involves codes of conduct, clear guardrails and guidance, responsibilities and accountabilities. As I said, as a voluntary organization, it's generally done with a lot of kindness and goodwill, but nevertheless, it still exists in order to prevent bad actors from subversing the process. Group relationships, of course, this is back to trying to work with everything from tag app runtime to tag sustainability. There's a huge range of not necessarily competing interests, but non-tessellating interests. That is the nature of any sort of socio-technical interaction. Then finally, once again, working within the operating guidelines. What do we present to THC? Well, every month we have to do something a little bit like this, close off a load of issues, because like any project on GitHub, we languish some of the old issues, working in a minute, contributor activities. So this Flatcar assessment, Flatcar is a CoreOS fork. And I was a big fan of CoreOS back in the day. CoreOS got bought by Red Hat. We then turned it into Fedora CoreOS. Involk then forked Flatcar Linux from that. And here we have Flatcar. So the actual lineage of the project goes Gentoo, Chrome OS, which is built from Gentoo. It has this Omaha dual partition atomic update system. So Gentoo, Chrome OS, CoreOS, Flatcar. So one of the first questions were, where does the code come from? Oh, everywhere. And then we kind of dug into how they accept code contributions, how they're merged in, how CI works, how the CI is isolated, what their 2FA is, the different kinds of access, by VPN or code commits or SSH access, etc. And that's the level of depth that the assessment goes to. It is guided by the people on the assessment and from a tag perspective, their capabilities. So we're lucky to have, for example, people who are very concerned with supply chain security. That means we can get under the hood of recency, freshness, cryptographic hashing, content addresses in the same breath. That's the kind of thing that Flatcar got. Zero Trust white paper. I'll talk about the working groups. But we've generated a number of white papers, the Cloud Native Security white paper, the Supply Chain Security white paper, now the Zero Trust white paper, as a response to the Biden administration's impending, excellent legislation that will extend beyond suppliers, probably to the whole world eventually. So we try and get a jump on that and provide useful, tangible, non-exhaustive guidance for implementers. Fuzzing Handbook, there's a company called Ada Logics, who are actually based out of London, who basically fuzzed every open source project in the CNCF, doing an incredible job, and they're being sponsored by OSTIF, the Open Source Technology Improvement Fund, to do this work. The CTO of the Linux Foundation to contribute in. He said, maybe you guys should talk. So they've now written a few pages that will integrate into our assessment guide. And then all of a sudden we've just, the joy of open source, someone's contributed something and we can integrate it without having the expertise or the domain knowledge, rising tides or boats. And then presentations for 3 projects that are coming through in CNCF, Codebug, Knative Guard, and the I Am Privileged catalog. They have very different projects. And this abstract view of security where you can have a presentation and it may mean, for somebody who's not used Istio, Knative is then abstracting further. And so to listen to these kind of presentations and hear people with domain knowledge ask intelligent questions, this is where the point of the talk really makes sense, for me to say, but resonate in this wording. Because it is exposure to people with a far greater depth of experience, understanding, and insight in specific problem domains and security areas that really makes tag security such a rich and vibrant community. Just looking and listening can bring so much, speaking personally, so much education and so much reframing of considerations or thoughts I had in different perspectives. My request to the TAC this month was, can we have more volunteers from your magic volunteer pots? I don't know where that pot actually is, the end of a rainbow somewhere. Obviously, it's the eternal problem. And yeah, we're doing a few more things. The in progress and upcoming are the interesting bits, perhaps. Still working on FlatCar. New York University is going to engage a few hundred student threat model projects before they come to the tag, which will be fantastically interesting. Cilium is getting reopened. It's actually graduated. So in this case, we're perhaps slightly outside of our remits, but we'll see where that goes. And then we're going to be assessing Kubeflow, which is the next project that I will be leading, as well as pieces, KubeCon, excuse me. We are almost there, just having a look at what we've got in the repos on GitHub, the return of the raccoons. These are the kind of assessments that we're looking at the moment. Kubeflow is coming up. As I say, Cilium has actually graduated. So to some extent, the recommendation that the tag performs, which is things should be fixed or the project is graduated, makes little sense. Actually, in this particular case, FlatCar, again, is underway. Various things. Some people here have contributed to the Flux multi-tenancy, which is taking Flux v1 and turning it into a multi-tenant v2 GitOps operator. Questions then become, well, what about data access? How are you classifying data? And where is the memory, as they say, memory safety in Golang? But at what point could you have a key exposure across tenants and under what circumstances, etc.? And some of those questions resonated with the Flux team and they modified bits and pieces. And then presentations, the kind of things we've had coming through recently. Bank Vaults is Vault by another name. That's come under the new HashiCorp business license thing, which I think was kind of resonant for the essential to actually talk about the usage of the thing. Container security, we said, I improved the catalog. There was an interesting one from Intel on the secure software guiding principles. It's more or less boiled down to, are you using SBOMs? Are you dedicated to the safety of the consumers of your software? Are you dedicated to transparently fixing things? And then raised a lot of questions about, well, exactly how many teeth does this proposal have? Is it, again, purely advisory, or in the event of non-conformance with the statement, would you downgrade a supplier? And really sort of moving into the philosophical security realm to some extent. What is the intention here and how will this actually be used? And then the graph for understanding artifact composition, collaboration between some long-term collaborators in ag security, Hisari and Google, build an object graph of all dependencies. Again, very interesting recent piece. These things are so disparate and diverse, but they cover a range of future-leaning security topics that keep the mind fresh and engaged, I would say. The number of security reviews that we've done in the last couple of years, big ones there, notably in Toto, Caverna, and Opera, they're all fundamental supply chain or runtime security projects. Spiffy Spire, underpinning identity, and then Harbor, of course, actually the home of the supply in the chain. Again, that NIST controls mapping is a labor of love. But the Cloud Native Security White Paper has now been translated into 6 or 7 different languages. And I did this kind of, even though it is an English language group for the meetings, it's translated into, I think, Chinese, Japanese, Italian, a few other languages as well. Well, the upshot of all this is how to get started. Slack is a rich and verdant, again, stream of interesting links and things going past. People are perfectly welcome to join meetings with their cameras off. There is generally a request to introduce oneself or at least tag an affiliation or interest in the meeting notes, but it's by no means mandatory. You can also just jump in on a GitHub issue and say, this looks interesting. I would just like to observe. And again, it is this nature of being able to feed off the intellect of the people already in the group that I found terrifically accelerating my understanding and knowledge for some of these things, and then finally contribute. But this is a graded scale, of course. There's absolutely no requirement. It makes a lot of sense for the group if people just get meeting or observation level, because ultimately we're lacking in cybersecurity practitioners. So that really fulfills the group's mandate if people just are interested enough to observe. A quick whiz through one initiative that I put a lot of time into last year, is trying to move forward this the backlog of projects. So when we're looking to escalate projects through to graduates, we don't always need to do full exhaustive threat modeling and self-assessment. So this process, basically, we went through and we had an hour-long meeting with, some of the best people like Rory McKeon turned up, who's an old school Kubernetes hacker. Funny to be able to say that when it's only kind of 8 years old, but nevertheless. And we played this balance of, okay, well, what do we want? How are we going to make sure this Flux multi-tenancy review happens expediently? Because the problem with voluntary based organizations is, let's set up a doodle. Okay, it's going to be 3 weeks time, and the cadence, the frequency is so slow. So the goal here was to move everything into the synchronous meetings, do them as quickly as possible. We did that not only in the planning for the threat, but also the execution of it. We looked at the Mozilla Rapid Risk Assessment, which made a lot of sense. It provides a framework for non-experts to be able to still run through and have guardrails process, and then build these interview questions with the help of this raccoon. Where's the data? Where does it go? How is it communicated with? Do we have encryption? We've got untrusted sources. Where's our validation? We start off by trying to fundamentally understand how the project works. And then we build a data dictionary. The combination of these things, while simply destructuring the project, give a view and allow us to make high level recommendations back to the project. This is the way that we're trying to move security in cloud native forward more quickly. And with that, there's lots of ways to join us. Slack is probably the easiest and most interesting. And thanks very much for your time and attention. If anyone has one specific question, I'll happily answer it, or else I shall cede the floor. So metrics for resilience. Oh, yeah. So robustification is not a word, but I like it. Yeah, I mean, it is difficult. In order to measure the security of a given large project, you might do something like count the number of tickets or issues raised that have security as a side effect. Then you're beholden to the way they're treated. Maybe two different organizations don't do that quite the same way. You could also say, well, what's your, from a supply chain perspective, mean time to remediation? OpenSSL has a bug. It's a 0 day. Everyone needs to patch. How long did it take your project to fix it? Got good CI, good tests. It should be, less than a day, a few hours. Intrusion detection. Yes. I'm sorry. So how do you apply IDS to these projects? I mean, intrusion detection it sits at a slightly different level. So the projects that tend to come through would be, and Flatcar is a difficult one because it's an outlier, because it's an operating system. You don't normally assure operating systems. I can't use the words on the live stream because they'll come back to haunt me, but it's a reasonably sizable escapade. So from that perspective, intrusion detection is about who escalated their permissions outside of the bounding set that they were given in the first place. For most of these applications, you wouldn't necessarily detect an intrusion. For example, if somebody was able to escalate their permissions for Flux, then they would perhaps gain cluster admin credentials for another cluster. So Flux has an operational mode where there's a management cluster and it then controls X other clusters. If the management cluster was compromised, to all the other clusters would then be a beta attacker, and they would potentially then exploit those. Intrusion detection would then be a function of the Kubernetes API audit logs, or perhaps a shell spawning detection if someone's using a control S8 or something like that. So from an intrusion detection perspective, the closest we've come is something like System Falco, which is a detective intrusion detection system, as opposed to more sort of vendor-based products tend to detect, but then also shut something down. So while those things are security tools, we're more concerned with the security of the applications that lead to the initial compromise, because the operating system should have no open sockets or external ports that allow access. Whereas the applications running in Kubernetes have web-facing sockets, and that's where potentially someone can get in, remote code execution, container breakout or lateral movement, and then onto the underlying host or cloud infrastructure. And that's the point that CloudTrail or local intrusion detection will cover it. I mean, any sensible system should not only have intrusion detection as the last line of defense, because protective controls in the pipeline will go so far, active controls at runtime also so far, but then finally intrusion detection is the last line of defense, and also honeypots, canary tokens. Really, nothing is infallible. And so the greater number of sensors that a system has, I guess, proportional to the classification of the data on the system, we concern ourselves with the higher level rather than the operational.